welcome to my review for Nioh on the PlayStation 4. So how does this katana wielding samurai demon slaying badass fare? Well, we shall see. The main protagonist of Nioh is Williams. The story actually starts out with Williams being stuck in a prison, and he actually escapes the prison. And when he escapes, he actually meets up with a character called Edward Kelly, who becomes the main bad guy of Nioh. Something really bad happens, and then now Williams actually chasing Kelly. And with that chase, it actually goes into the Far East. Japan is where everything ends up, and that's where the real story of Nioh starts. So during the journey in Japan, Williams does meet some pretty cool characters, some really cool historical characters like Hanzo Hattori and Oda Nobunaga, and at the same time you also meet some pretty cool guardian spirits that you get along the journey. But the real drawback about the story is that I think it felt like a little bit of an afterthought, just because the fact that when you get into the game, the action and item collecting really becomes a bigger part of the game, and I feel like the story was just kind of like thrown in there just to get you going. So when you actually get to Japan, you learn that the game is split up into different stages that are going throughout different regions. So when you get into a region, it splits up into two different types of missions. You have your story mission, which of course lets you progress through the story, and that's how you beat the game. You also have submissions, which are a little bit of a smaller portion of that map that you did for the story mission, but they kind of just close off like certain routes that you can't go, and they could go from, instead of going from one way that you did during the story mission, you actually work from backwards. So small little things like that, and sometimes they actually throw you some different places that you never actually not even part of the story mission. And that's totally cool to me. So some of the stages vary from different locations. Some of the cooler maps to me were like the castle, where you actually go into like a shinobi castle or ninja castle, and it has a bunch of traps. You go to some burnt out village, they actually have to help out. There's a bunch of bandits there. You go to caves where there's a bunch of yokais, and it literally goes throughout the whole regions of Japan, and you get totally different looks, and you know what, they all look pretty fantastic. But there are some pretty cool enemy designs. To me, they look freaking fantastic. You have normal human enemies, then it ranges up to more of these big hulking yokais, and like one of my super favorite yokais from the game are these small little cyclops yokais that kind of just they stumble around the map, and when you see them, you're like, oh, these things must be pretty easy. But when you actually get to fight them, they are super fast. And then what they do is they kind of jump around, and when you try to attack them, they'll dodge back. So you got to be super quick, super athletic to get to attack them. They don't have much life, but when they jump back, they can actually whip out their tongue and actually drain a little bit of amoretta from you, which can turn them into these big hulking cyclops. So that to me was really the first time I fought that. It really caught me off by surprise. I'm like, these things aren't that powerful. I killed one really quick, and then the second time I fought one, I'm like, I got this. When to fight him, he jumped around, drained some amoretta, turned into this big hulking yokai, and pretty much destroyed me. But the real problem comes from the variety of enemies in the game. The game really doesn't have much. I mean, you've seen most of the enemies in the first half of the game. The second half, they'll throw some different looking enemies at you. They are actually the same enemies, just kind of a little bit of different movesets. They kind of aesthetically look a little bit different. But like I said, most of the time, you pretty much taking out all these enemies, and they just kind of just throw them in there for you, and it just becomes a chore when you actually fight the same enemies over and over and over again. So where the game shines is really its bosses. The bosses for the game are super cool looking. You know, you have some pretty cool bosses, and each stage has a different boss. So one of the bosses I really like fighting was I think it was called the Nioh, which is this big like tiger dog looking monster that shoots out electricity at you, and that was freaking awesome to fight. I think it took me like 10 tries to actually beat him, because you kind of had to learn the move sets first, and you kind of learn a little bit. You're eventually gonna die, and then you learn. But the monster itself looked pretty cool. It shoots out lightning at you. You know, it shoots out thunder at you, and it does this quick spin attack that he falls down. It's kind of like a trick spin attack. He falls down, but he actually gets up pretty quick. So to me, that was one of my favorite fights in the game. The stages in Nioh tend to be a little bit on the shorter side. There is no interconnected world, so everything is just one and done kind of deal. There are ways to get around a little quicker. You do get to these shrines that you call upon, which you can use it to level up your characters and other things like that. But like I said, the stages are really on the shorter side. I think I've gone through a few stages in like 15 or 30 minutes. I think the longest I've ever been in a stage was an hour and a half, and that's probably with me just going straight through it with just a little bit of looking between nooks and crannies, but nothing like super extensive. So they're mostly on the shorter side. But to me, I actually like the shorter side of the stages, just because it's just really a sigh of relief when you finish it. The other games like Dark Souls and everything, when you actually are, all the stages are interconnected, it's very tough to kind of walk around it. You feel like there's no place to rest. But for me, Nioh, you can actually rest after a battle. A sigh of relief when you're done with the boss fight. You're just like, huh, and then you move on to the next one. Nioh is a tough game, and it'll kick you down a few pegs. Nioh, to me, it's a tough game, but it's fair. It's a very fair game. You learn the mechanics, you get better at the game, and that's how the game teaches you. At the beginning, you're going to get knocked down, and you're going to die so many times. I remember finding the first boss, I died like 15 or 20 times, and then I finally, as you keep playing, you learn a little bit more of how these bosses move. You learn their attack patterns, you learn all that, and you learn a little bit of patience, a little bit of persistence, and that's how the game kind of sets you. And you play it, you learn the boss's moves, you learn how they attack, you learn all that, and then you kind of use what you've been teaching yourself, and that's how you beat bosses in the game. There are a few times where some bosses are a little bit easier than others. I felt like a few of the bosses, I beat them on the first try, but there's some bosses like this big slime boss that you fight, this jelly boss I should say, and that took me a little bit while because I didn't know how to fight it, and I was just kind of running around like, oh, let me see if I can judge his attack patterns and things like that, and that's how I did it, and that's how I was able to beat him. You learn the game, and then you take what you learned, and then you beat the boss. To me, Nioh was probably one of my favorite action games that I've played in a while. In Nioh, you can equip up to 4 different weapons, 2 melee weapons and 2 ranged weapons. The melee weapons are katana, dual katana, spears, axe, and kusarigamas, which are pretty much these little hook dagger kind of things where you can swing around with a little chain ball at the end. So it's pretty cool, pretty fast. And then you got your ranged weapons that are bows, flintlocks, and hand cannons. So the biggest draw to the game is its melee weapon stances. There's 3 stances that you have. You have your high stance, which are pretty much powerful attacks, but they're slow to pull off. You got your low stance, which is lower attack power, but they're super quick. And then you got your medium stance, who is a little bit of both, where it has really good range, it has really good attack, and a really good speed, but it's just like in the middle. So it's really a good defense, kind of a beginner level of fighting. And then learning how to use those stances will become key in battle, really, because when you're fighting, you see this enemy that's quicker than you are, so maybe you want something a little bit more quicker to attack it, or you got these big old enemies that have a lot of HP, but they're kind of slow, so if you want to chip down their health a bit, you go with the high stance. So it all depends on what enemy you're fighting, And at the end of the day, when you learn more and more skills about your weapons, you actually get some pretty cool stuff. Like katanas have, you know, parry attacks that are able to parry, and then key pulse and things like that. So you learn all those and you put them together, and it becomes this kind of almost like a combo-esque kind of game where you're playing and you're just doing combos, and then you learn the mechanics, and then you just become almost like a god at fighting. So at the same time, you also have two other skills that you're able to learn. You're able to learn ninjutsu, which is a little bit different. They're more melee or projectile base attacks. You know, you throw ninja stars, you throw pills at people that, you know, it stuns them, poisons them, so anything like that. You also got Nioh magic, which is some pretty cool stuff that you get. You know, you could paralyze people, you could stun them, you could do all that. You also buff yourself with different things like being able to heal yourself. You're able to pretty much increase your attack or your defense and things like that. And of course, you could also debuff enemies. Ki also plays a big part in battle. Each time you swing or block, it uses a portion of your ki. When you are depleted of ki, you will be in a vulnerable state that leaves you open for punishment. The cool part about ki is that enemies also will use ki, so you can drain their ki and do a massive damage back at them. Ki also helps with dispersing yokai pools. These yokai pools that are left over by some of the yokai can be dangerous since it halts your ki regeneration. To battle against that, you will have to do a ki pulse, which, if done correctly, it will disperse the yokai pool and also regain some of your ki back. And so the last ability you have is called the living weapon. So what is a living weapon? It is your guardian that you get in the beginning of the game. That is your living weapon. What it does is when you use your living weapon, it turns into it fuses with your weapons and it gives you a buff. Depends on what living weapon you uses. It could be fire, it could be water, it could be wind, it could be earth, etc, etc. And then, you know, once that spirit goes into your weapon, it's infused with it and infused with that element. You cause more damage, and of course you get a quick invisibility buff, so they can't hurt you. Of course, when they do hurt you, your health actually doesn't go down. It's actually the living weapons timer. So once that timer hits 0, you go back down to normal. And it's a really great ability to use when you're in a pinch. Literally, when you're about to die, pop it up and you won't go back to full health, but you'll stop yourself from dying. And of course, I tend to use it more towards when, you know, the boss is about to die. You know, he has like maybe 10% health left. You can use it, pop it real quick, and then just pretty much mow down the boss. So when killing yokais or other people in the game, you gain this thing called Amrita, which is Nioh's version of EXP. You can spend these Amrita on stats like body, strength, magic, and spirits, and each stat will of course raise a different stat, which is like your HP, your ki, your weapon damage, and etc. Amrita isn't really the only thing that drops from enemies. Amrita is a really big commodity in the Nioh universe, but weapons and armor are the biggest, I think the second biggest part of the game. It's really, when you kill enemies, they pop out like crazy. It's very, very loot heavy, a loot heavy game. You kill an enemy and like 3 things drops from it, and you pick it up and you just figure out if, you know, it's good for you. If it's not good for you, you can sell it, you can do all this stuff with it. Equipment usually comes in different rarities. You got the most common, which are white, and the most rarest, which are divine items, which are green. And with equipment, they all have their own stats that boosts your character. So each equipment have something that, you know, you can raise your characters, you know, HP, you can raise your character's defense, you can raise your character's Amrita gain, you can raise your character's gold gain, and things like that. So each stat really combines together to become something bigger of a stat. So you kind of have to figure out what you want on your characters before you want to equip something, or you decide to go 100% on that weapon or armor. You kind of want to figure out what you want your characters to be so you can spec into that. Gold is the main currency of Nioh, and it'll become your friend at the end. Your main time and usage of gold will come in the form of the blacksmith. With the blacksmith, you can buy different items, weapons, and armor. You can also forge for different weapons. You can also soul match your weapons. What soul matching is when you have an item or equipment that, you know, you really like. So it's a level, like pretend it's a level 1 armor, and you really like the stats on it, and you're like, man, I don't want to give up with it. Well, you can actually soul match it to a different armor piece, which pretend that armor piece is 5, so you can soul match that together, so your armor becomes a level 5 armor, and it keeps up with you. The only problem with that is if you go higher and higher and higher for your soul matching, it becomes more costly, and to the point where it's kind of like, oh yeah, I kind of just want to leave it alone because I can't soul match anymore with it because it's just costing too much. You can also refashion your equipment with the blacksmith. What refashion does is it turns one of your items, like an armor piece or a weapon piece, and refashion it to something that you already learned, or you already seen, an armor that you already seen, or a weapon that you already seen. You can refashion into it. So pretend you got this armor that you're not a big fan of. Maybe you like the stats on it, but it's you're more of a heavy geared armor kind of looking, but you like the stats for a lighter gear. Well, you can refashion it into the heavy looking gear armor without having to keep that weight class. So it's very, very a cool way to make your character and change how your character looks, and everybody will be totally different. And then the last two are reforging and disassemble. For reforging, that is probably the main part of the blacks. With reforging, you can actually change stats on a weapon. So pretend you want a defense on your armor, but it doesn't have one. It has luck instead. Well, you can try to reforge it, or reforge it so it can turn into that. So you have to pay money. You got to pay crafting materials, and then you reforge it and you roll it until it becomes what you want. It's not 100%, but if you have enough money, if you have enough materials, you could keep re-rolling it until you get to the stat, or the stat that you want. And then disassemble is pretty much what it is. You disassemble armor and weapons into crafting materials they can use for crafting, crafting new armor, crafting new weapons, reforging, and other things like that. Multiplayer wise, you can co-op with someone on your friend list, or join a random person who's offering a Ochoko cup. You can also call upon others in the game also. What you have to do is go to a shrine and offer a Ochoko cup and wait for a person to join. My only problem with this solution is that you can't co-op unless both of you and your friend have beaten the stage. This restricts you to only calling randoms when you need help with a mission. Graphically, the game is not that bad looking. It looks pretty good. Nothing really pops out for me other than really I like the Japanese aesthetics of the game, and of course the cool looking boss yokais that you fight during the end of the stage. To me, those are freaking fantastic. And some of them are like the ogres are pretty cool looking to me. The ones that you fight normally, or they pop up sometimes. Those to me were pretty cool. But the biggest part about the game that I really enjoyed is that developers gave you different choices. So before starting the game, you actually are given 3 choices you can pick. Or actually, you don't get given those, but you can go to the options. You can pick 3 choices. You got your movie mode, which is kind of a better looking game. It's more pleasing to the eyes. It's graphically it looks better, more sharper, and things like that. The image quality is better, but it is kept at 30 frames per second. You got action mode, which is you lose a little bit of picture quality, but you gain that 60 frames per second, which to me was my favorite. And then you got variable mode, which is a little bit of both. You got your 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, so it stays in between that. So it could be 45, it could be 50, it could be all that. So you keep that, but you also keep a better picture quality. So it fluctuates. It doesn't look as good as movie mode, but and it doesn't run or perform as good as action mode, but you get a little bit in that little middle. Personally, I went with the 60 frames per second or the action mode because I like that so much better. The game to me fits perfectly with 60 frames per second. And I applaud the developers for giving us options to do things like that. I wish more games will let you have, kind of what the Tomb Raider and this one does. Let you have more options you can use, you can do, because to me, giving us, the players, more options is always better. Music-wise, there isn't really much music going on unless it's in a cutscene or when you're in a boss battle, but when there is music, it's totally fantastic. But what I do really like is really the quietness of the game. It's very eerie looking, sound sounding game when you're walking around these stages, this abandoned castle, this abandoned village, and all you hear is crows crowing and little footsteps, and then you hear little grunts and things like that. To me, that is totally freaking me out. The game's already hard enough, and now you also have these creepy sounds in the background. Totally freaks me out, and I love it. So in the end, I really enjoyed the difficulty of Nioh. I think it's, coming from a guy who's kind of likes games on the easier side. I mean, I don't like it super easy, but anything of like Nioh, what Nioh is doing, it's tough. But like I said, I really enjoyed it so far from what I played. It really pushed me to sit down and think about what I'm doing, think about what I had to plan next to do something. Like I said, it's really the persistence and patience is what is key to this type of game. It's very, the first time you die and you get frustrated and you're just like, man, I cannot do this, and then come back and you're like, okay, let me play it again. Let me figure something out. If I'm not doing it right, there's probably something I need to change. And then you go in there, you change something up, and you're like, oh, hey, that's better. I did something good. And then you keep doing it until you beat it. Like I said, what I said about the first boss, that's what happened to me. I went in, got totally destroyed my first time. I'm like, man, this is tough. Second time I went in, got destroyed too. I'm like, okay, I'm getting a little bit better. I dodged a few hits. Third time I went in again, did so much better. There's just one little mess up that I did, and it cost me a big chunk of my health. And then finally the 10th or 15th time, I'm like, I got this, and I went in there, destroyed the boss, and I was like, yeah, this is the game for me. Also, the loot system for me is freaking fantastic. I love the loot system of the game. Being able to get all these loot, even though some of them are like, hey, I don't need this. And being able to get all those loot and just disassemble them if you want to. You can feed it to your other weapons to give it that level. To me, the loot system in here, a Diablo-like loot system, freaking love it. You're farming out there for new armor, for new weapons. You can sell it, make money, and things like that. It's always giving me to go to the next one. I freaking love that. But with all my glowing, expectation of the game does fall down a bit. I mean, I really loved enemy designs, but there are not a lot of enemies designs. There's just a few handful of them, and if you've seen them one, you've seen them all pretty much. Other than reskinned ones with different type of moveset. You also have the kind of the story where it kind of just moves along. I mean, there's some times where I'm just like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm just having too much fun playing the game, and that's, to me, what's the problem with Nioh is really the story. When we had story, it was good, but most of the time you're just kind of like, okay, go on to the next stage, go on to the next stage, go on to the next stage. So in the end, I am giving Nioh on the PlayStation 4 a 10 out of 10. Really love the game, super enjoyed it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed my review for Nioh. Like I said, it's a game where you're really you have to learn how to play. You have to be patient. I know a lot of people aren't patient. A lot of people give up right away, and was one of me, and that's probably still me. But you play the game, you become patient, you learn the game, and that, to me, once you get that, it clicks in your head, it just becomes a whole different game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the review. Hopefully you guys come back for some more reviews that I have going on that should be out hopefully soon. Anyways, this is Omega Belmont, and I'll see everybody next time. Peace out.
見事な技にござった。